Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 81, James Mace. James Mace was a riverboat captain who worked on the Murray and its tributaries from the 1860s. He was born on the 8th of May 1831 in Hintington, County Durham, to James Mace and Elizabeth Davidson, and he was the fourth child of 10. He arrived in Australia as one of the crew of the Sea Queen, but he was charged with refusing duty in December 1851. As a result, he was either discharged or he absconded from his duty, and he married Sarah Ann Roos on the 26th of November 1859 at Port Elliot, South Australia, at the home of her father, John Roos. Sarah Ann Roos was born in July 1837 in Cambridge, England. She immigrated from London on the Ascendant and arrived on the 15th of January 1851 with her parents, John Roos and Mary Alice, and her 4 siblings. John Roos was 41 when they emigrated, and he had been an agricultural labourer from Lincolnshire, England. He farmed at Encounter Bay, South Australia, when they arrived. Sarah and James had 6 children. Mary Ann in 1861 at Goolwa, South Australia. Alice in 1863, also at Goolwa. John in 1866 in Echuca. James in Echuca in 1867, as well as David in Echuca in 1869. So the first record of James Mace being a master of a vessel on the Murray River was on the 15th of September 1860. And it says that the Warcool steamer arrived with James Mace as the master from the Murrumbidgee River to Goolwa and the barge Avoca in tow. They had 11 bales of wool and 3 casks of tallow, and he mastered the boat on behalf of F. Cadell. Cadell had actually sent James Mace to the upper Edward River in June 1860, and that is to the township of Deniliquin. He entered a race with Captain Johnson on his boat Mulgawanki, and the details of this were outlined in the book Saltbush Country, History of the Deniliquin District by John Bushby. It said, the screw-propelled boat Warcool, owned by Cadell and skippered by Captain Mace, was a former barge but was fitted with an engine. It was built at the junction of the Warcool and Murray rivers to the order of Cadell, but his experiences with it convinced him that screw-propelled vessels could not successfully navigate the snag-ridden streams like the Edward. The Warcool entered the Edward from the lower Murray near Deniliquin in June 1860. Captain Johnson was a former skipper of Cadell's fleet, and he decided also to make an experimental voyage along the Warcool, Edward and a branch system. Johnson entered his boat into the Warcool River behind Cadell's Warcool, and the 2 steamers engaged in a race to be the first up the Edward in much the same manner as Randall and Cadell had vied for the honour of being the first on the Murray. Johnson was an experienced riverman. He'd been a skipper on the first boat to reach Howlong 6 years earlier. He had bought the Mulgawanki in May 1860, and it had left Goolwa on the 12th of June 1860 laden with cargo for sale on the journey. It entered the Edward River on the 5th of July, arrived at Moolameen 2 days later with the barge Unknown in tow. The barge was lowered with several tons of fencing wire and a quantity of stores for settlers around Moolameen. The Mulgawanki arrived at Deniliquin on the 13th of July 1860, beating the Warcool by 5 days. James Mace's slow trip was largely due to its greater draft and a damaged screw. The Pastoral Times reported the Mulgawanki's arrival. Early on Saturday morning, 13th of July 1860, the discharge of a cannon was heard in Deniliquin, and about 10 o'clock the Mulgawanki was seen steaming up the river carrying a party of ladies and gentlemen from Warburton. On coming to her moorings opposite the Masonic Hall, a cheer was raised by a rapidly assembled crowd, and immediately the planks were thrown ashore the vessel and was visited by a large number of persons anxious to congratulate the captain on the success of his trip. The day that the boat arrived, John Taylor invited a numerous party to be present at the Royal Hotel to honour the pioneers of the Edward River navigation. D.G. Jones, proprietor of the Pastoral Times, presided, and in reply to a toast, Captain Johnson said he had received sufficient orders to induce him to come up the Edward again. His recent experience with snags in the river may have led him to add that he did not know whether the vessel would come quite as far as Deniliquin. The following day, a large crowd gathered to see the boat depart. The captain kept an open house, and many ladies and gentlemen availed themselves of the opportunity of a pleasant water trip. The punt cable was lowered, and for a short time the north was isolated from the south. The vessel pulled in at North Deniliquin when a gun was fired and a number of residents went aboard. A second stop was made at the residence of Mr. Thomas Robertson, where many of the ladies disembarked and some cargo was landed. After a short delay, the boat steamed up to the Upper Deniliquin station of James Tyson. The owner of this station had ordered that a portion of his bridge be cut to provide a sufficient aperture for the safe passage of the boat. On being refuelled at this station, the vessel proceeded on her voyage. Johnston had considerable trouble locating the course of the Edward, but eventually he reached the Murray just below Tocumwal, thus completing a journey along the entire Murray Loop, the Warkall, Edward and a branch system. The boat is believed to have reached the Murray via Tupple Creek, which forms part of the Edward floodplain. The Warkall, meantime, was described as a pretty-looking vessel and had arrived at Deniliquin on the Wednesday after the Mulwanky and stayed for some days to dispose of a big cargo of flour, tea, sugar and other goods. There's no mention of any other steamers on the Edward for many years after the arrival of these two boats in 1860. And it was reported in the South Australian Register by Captain Cadell on the 20th of July 1860, "My steamer reached Deniliquin on the 8th, where her loss of a screw was replaced. Her having thus pushed her way up proves the practicability of navigating the River Edward." And because of the river being in flood at the time, Johnston was the only navigator who did a complete loop because of those floodplains. So he was able to come down from South Australia, from the Murray to the Edward at Moolameen, into Warkall River, then into the Edward River, and he was able to follow the Edward River south to cut across near Tocumwal to go back into the Murray, when normally that would not be able to be achieved in years where there weren't floodwaters. So on the 23rd of July 1860, there was an article outlining the navigation of the Edward. The history, or rather the progress of inland navigation, is of so much importance to these colonies and to the Australian continent that every new step in its advancement is worthy of record. For some time past, the successful navigation of the Edward has been exciting as much hope and affording as much interest in the Trans-Murray districts as did Captain Cadell's enterprise on the Murray itself a few years ago in this colony and in South Australia. And Southern Courier reported the arrival of the first steamers at Deniliquin. After the cannon roused the attention of the residents of Deniliquin, there was a sharp hissing sound as if blowing off steam, and there was a general rush to the river, where the Mulgawanky, with Captain Johnson as commander, was hoving inshore, having on board lady passengers that had been taken up from the Warbricken and the parsonage. It was about 5 weeks since the Mulgawanky left Goolwa, with a barge in tow and 130 tons of cargo. He had Mr. Sash, an ironmonger of Port Elliot, as a passenger. She had disposed of a greater part of her cargo at Moolameen before arriving here and left the barge also at Moolameen, shortly before reaching which place she passed Captain Cadell's steamer, the Warkall. The following morning, at 12:30, with a full complement of passengers, the steamer resumed her voyage, the majority of the passengers disembarking at the Pound, where Mr. Robertson entertained them at a luncheon. The vessel then proceeded on her way, discharging the greater part of her remaining cargo at Mr. Tyson's station, and here some 20 feet of the bridge put up by that gentleman had to be cut away to enable the steamer to pass. It was the intention of Captain Johnson to get through, if possible, to the Murray. On Wednesday afternoon, between 2 and 3 o'clock, the Warkall arrived. This vessel was expected a fortnight or 3 weeks ago, but finding the Edward not navigable when she first entered it, she turned back and went to Swan Hill, where she quitted a good part of her cargo. On entering the stream the second time, and before getting to Moolameen, the screw broke, an accident which caused further detention. Independently of this accident, the Warkall draws 3.5 feet of water, the Mulgawanky not drawing as much as 2 feet, and the funnel is higher, and she brings more cargo. The screw is not adapted for the navigation of a river full of snags. The masters of both vessels described the navigation as exceedingly difficult, both from snags and overhanging timber. And from their statements, we feel little doubt that steamboat traffic on the Edward, unless the river were cleared, would prove a losing speculation. And another boat that Captain Mace skippered was the Lady Daly, and it mentions that the Lady Daly was one of the earliest and largest boats trading to Echuca. Captain Mace was her skipper. She used to go right up to Albury, and on one of these trips, it is noted that she had difficulty in getting under the bridge at Waggunya. The centre post and bridge had to be struck and part of the pilot house sawn off. She left Echuca on the 27th of August on this particular trip, arriving in Albury on September the 14th. There was a pretty heavy loading of 160 tonnes discharged at Waggunya, and on the way up and then further consignments at Albury followed a reload, and she went downstream. There are many twists and turns of the river. Mace realised with astonishment that boats penetrated as far as Gundagai in the eastern Riverina. In flood time, the boats used to go right up the Edward. Regular journeys were made up the Edward as far as it was possible to go. So by March 1864, James Mace was the master of the Lady Daly, making regular trips. At this time, he was heading to Blanchetown, and he had passengers on board, a Reverend Mr. and Mrs. Ross and servant, and Mr. and Mrs. Davy, as well as 2 ladies in the saloon, and they carried a cargo of 69 bales of hay and 120 bags of salt. In May 1864, the Lady Daly, with 240 tonnes of cargo, was sailing from Goolwa to Waggunya via Blanchetown with 403 bags of wheat and 20 tonne of flour. He then did a return trip back to Goolwa. It arrived at Goolwa from the Upper Murray River. He had Mr. Ford in the saloon as a passenger, and he had 100 bales of wool on board. In February 1865, it mentions in an Adelaide paper that the steamer Lady Daly, Captain James Mace, arrived at Blanchetown yesterday at noon, having made the run down from Wentworth in 35 steaming hours and in 44 hours from port to port, bringing 38 bales of wool, 60 empty hogsheads for the Goolwa Brewery. She left Blanchetown on her upward trip on the 25th of January, taking the first shipment of goods on board. She ran as far as the Walcool Junction, having been obliged on one occasion to discharge nearly the whole of her cargo in order to pass a reef. There are reports that the Upper Murray is very low and the river throughout is falling very fast. 2 months later, in April 1865, it mentions that James Mace had arrived at Goolwa on the 19th of April from the Darling River, and then on the 21st, 2 days later, he had 150 tonne of cargo on his way to Wentworth. He also had 20 tonnes of pressed hay. And in July 1865, on the 28th of June, on board the steamer Lady Darling at Cobdolga Station, River Murray at South Australia, Elizabeth, the eldest daughter of Captain James Mace, died at 5 years and 3 months. And an article in the Riverine Herald outlines the death of his little girl. A sad occurrence took place on the upward trip of the Lady Darling, which will be heard with regret by numerous friends of Captain Mace, the master of that vessel. While the steamer lay at Molang, his eldest daughter Elizabeth, who was in her 6th year, was taken with a fit. Medical assistance was procured and the child rallied a little. The vessel proceeded on her voyage. At Cobdolga Station, the poor little girl, who had evidently been sinking for some time, breathed her last. She lies buried in a pretty spot under a pine tree at Paringa Station. And online there was a mention with James Mace that he had lost 2 sons by asphyxiation, probably carbon monoxide poisoning from charcoal embers in a closed cabin on the Lady Daly in 1865. I couldn't find a mention of the death of 2 sons in that time or an article outlining the death of these children, but worthy of a mention. So James arrived on the Lady Darling from Goolwa with station stores for the Murray and the Darling in the same month that his daughter died. And in July 1866, the steamer Cumberuna was built at Echuca for the Albury Steam Navigation Company. The vessel was named after John Hawes' Cumberuna property, the name coming from an Aboriginal word meaning crooked river. This was likely to have been the reason for his son James's middle name, James Cumberuna Mace. On the 20th of June 1866, the Riverine Herald in Echuca reported, "On Saturday afternoon, the launch of this fine steamer, built at Echuca, was safely accomplished. The launch attracted a goodly concourse of ladies and gentlemen to witness it and to partake of the hospitality of the owners. At about 3 o'clock, all being in readiness, the usual christening ceremony was performed by Captain Mace's little daughter, and the Cumberuna glided off the ways into the river with perfect safety amid the cheers of the assembly, who then proceeded to indulge in the conviviality usual on such occasions, and toast followed toast in rapid succession." An advertisement in the Melbourne Argus claimed, "The passenger accommodation is considerably superior to any boat on the river. Her saloons are elegantly and comfortably fitted, and her other accommodations will be found equal to any. The vessel had a separate cabin fitted up for ladies and a stewardess on board, and the trip from Echuca to Albury cost £4. Her maiden voyage from Echuca to Albury in July, however, did not go as planned. The vessel hit a snag and sank. It was reported that the forward cabin and the portion of the deck are out of water, but the aft saloon is submerged and there are 3 feet of water in it. Repairs had the Cumberuna back on the water, and she finally arrived in Albury on the 23rd of August 1866 with Captain James Mace at the helm, and a public holiday was proclaimed in celebration. However, her speed got her into trouble again in October 1869. With a barge in tow, the boat collided with the Waganya boat while trying to overtake in a narrow part of the Moira Lakes near Barmah. George Skinner, a young man steering the barge, was thrown overboard and drowned. Captain Mace was found culpable, and he had his master's certificate suspended for 12 months. And it was outlined in the papers on this collision and the subsequent suspension of James Mace. It's on the 20th of November 1869, collision between the Cumberuna and Waganya. At the police court Moama on Thursday, before Mr Maunsell, Police Magistrate of Moama, and Mr Langford, Police Magistrate of Echuca, James Mace, master of the Cumberuna steamer, was brought up under warrant, charged with feloniously killing and slaying one George Skinner on the 30th of October. The deceased was the man who was steering the barge at the time of the collision between the two steamers and was subsequently missed, having been drowned, whether in consequence of the collision or otherwise was unknown. The body was afterwards picked up on a return trip of the Cumberuna and delivered to the police at Moama. A magisterial inquiry was held, after which a summons was issued for Mace, which he did not obey, and a warrant was consequently issued for his apprehension. The evidence, which was very similar to that likely to be given at the inquiry before the local Steam Navigation Board, exonerated Mace from the charge brought against him in the opinion of the bench, by whom the case was dismissed. And there was a more detailed article outlining the events that led to the death. The late collision in the river. Inquiry. The investigation into the causes of the late collision between the steam vessels Cumberuna and Waganya commenced on the 19th of November. W.P. Doolan deposed that on the 31st of October last, he was steering the barge of the Waganya about daylight when he saw the Cumberuna across the bends of the river, a considerable distance behind. Between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, she overhauled the Waganya in a narrow part of the river running through the Moira Lakes. When close by, Captain Mace, master of the Cumberuna, gave a loud whistle. The Waganya was then in the bend where the collision subsequently took place. The Cumberuna immediately afterwards ran into the Waganya when the latter vessel eased her engines and afterwards stopped. She then went ahead to clear herself and barge of the other vessel, the Cumberuna's barge having come into collision with that of the Waganya, which was touching the starboard of the New South Wales bank of the river. The former barge shot ahead and struck against the stump of a tree. Some of the hands of the Cumberuna endeavoured to push her off, but being unable to do so, they cut the painter. Heard afterwards there was a man overboard. I did not see him fall or see him in the water. In cross-examination, the witness said it might be about 10 miles from the place where the Cumberuna was first sighted to the place where the collision occurred. The barge of the Cumberuna was across the towlins of the barge of the Waganya, and Captain Page, master of the Waganya, ordered the tow line to be cut, which was done. After it was cut, the barge drifted round to a point and made fast to the New South Wales bank. When Captain Mace called out to his men to ask if they were ready to start, they replied that one of the hands was drowned. He did not appear to be aware of it until then. The Waganya was about 20 feet from the starboard bank. It was impossible for the Cumberuna to have passed at that point. There was sufficient time for the Cumberuna to have prevented a collision by easing or stopping her engines. Thomas Smith, a bargeman belonging to the Waganya, deposed that he was on board the barge when the collision took place. He heard Page sing out to Mace and hold up his hand previous to the collision. The Cumberuna did not alter her rate of speed when approaching the Waganya. He believes that she was going 6 or 7 knots. There was not room for 2 steamers to pass. When the Cumberuna whistled, she was close to the barge of the Waganya. William Sugden, mate of the Wiradjuri steamer, knew the part of the river where the collision took place. Two steamers could not pass there in full speed. It is of the opinion Mace should have shortened speed and waited until the Waganya got into a straight reach. The river there is about 140 feet wide. It would be necessary for one steamer to lie to in order to allow another to pass in that part. In cross-examination, the witness said he should have eased his engines if he had passed the Waganya's barge and come abreast of the steamer's quarter. The Kumbaruna is a faster boat than the Waganya, and both being paddle boats require more room than stern-wheel boats. The customary rule for every steamer when approaching another vessel, when there is a risk of collision, is to slacken speed and, if necessary, stop and reverse. Henry Thies, the fireman of the Waganya, received orders first to ease and after stopping her engines, which he did on the morning of the collision. The first order was given about 5 minutes before the Kumbaruna struck the Waganya. If the Kumbaruna had eased her engines 5 minutes before she struck, the collision would not have taken place. William Ring, seaman, was on board of the barge of the Kumbaruna. They were coming from Waganya to Echuca. On the previous day, they came to the woodpile at Warprins. The Waganya was lying there. He heard Page say to Mace, "I hope you will not come down upon us." And Mace said, "We shall overtake you about Irons Farm." Also heard him say he would run over him or run him down. The Waganya left some time before the Kumbaruna. The latter, after leaving the woodpile, continued her course and overtook the Waganya a little on this side of Irons Farm. She then eased her speed and shortly afterwards increased it again and again overtook the Waganya in the narrow part of the river. He saw the two steamers alongside one another. The Kumbaruna struck the Waganya on the port bow just before the paddle box. The Kumbaruna then dropped in between the Waganya and her barge, and the barge witness was in was going along the Kumbaruna's port side. When the barge got past her, let go of the tow line and went down the bank about 100 yards, and one of the hands, George Skinner, jumped ashore and made fast a line to a tree. He then jumped on board the barge and made it fast aft. He then got a cork fender and went away aft with it. The witness next saw him in the water. He was drowned. The whistle of the Kumbaruna was blown a little above the Irons. The Irons is 4 or 5 miles from the place where the collision occurred. The steamers were 1.5 miles apart when the whistle was last blown. Captain Mace was at its wheel when the collision took place, and he could see the Waganya from the wheel. He heard Page say to him, "Hold on, you may as well stop until I get a little lower down." And Mace replied, "Get out of the way or I will run you down." This was at the time of the collision. The speed of the Kumbaruna was not slackened or the engines reversed on approaching the Waganya. The Waganya got as close to the starboard bank as she could. The blow from the Kumbaruna appeared to drive her towards the bank. The engines of both vessels were then stopped, and there was not sufficient room for the two steamers to pass. They might have passed in safety about 3/4 of a mile ahead. The steamers with barges require more room to pass than steamers without barges. William Burton, stevedore, had a conversation with Captain Mace the day after the Kumbaruna arrived at Echuca. Witness said it was a bad job to lose a man. Mace said it was, but if ever the Waganya come across his horse again, he would run him over. He did not appear to blame the Waganya for not letting him pass. Joseph Edward Page, master of the Waganya, deposed he saw the Kumbaruna across the bends 4 or 6 miles astern. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, the Kumbaruna came into the same bend as the Waganya and continued to gain upon her. The witness put his helm sport in order to hug the starboard bank and continued in that position and eased his engines. The Kumbaruna then passed the witness's barge, and when she was within speaking distance, the witness said to Mace, "You might have waited until we got a little lower." And Mace said, "You are dashed nice fellow." And immediately afterwards, the Kumbaruna struck the Waganya on the port bow. Cannot say what speed the Kumbaruna was going. Witness made an entry of the occurrence immediately, in which the entry was read. He could do no more than he did to avoid the collision. The Waganya was going 5 or 6 knots at the time of the collision. James Robertson, the engineer on board the Kumbaruna, who deposed that the whistle of the Kumbaruna was blown on the morning of the collision a little after daylight. The witness eased the engines on the usual signal being given. This was about a mile above the place where the collision took place. Afterwards, he saw the two vessels near another and felt a concussion. He increased speed again after turning around the bend referred to and continued the same speed until the collision took place. The machinery was in good working order, so that witness could have obeyed any instructions to back or stop if he received them. He did not see the man Skinner fall overboard. The bends are all short where the collision took place. He would not attempt to pass a steamer at the point where the collision took place, but might have passed in safety some distance above. Walter McIver, mate of the Cumberuna, came on deck when the steamer was passing the barge of the Waganya. Captain Mace was steering at the time. On seeing the position of the steamers, the witness unhooked the tow line and let the Cumberuna's barge go. A few seconds after the steamers came into collision, the starboard bow of the Cumberuna touched the Waganya abaft her paddle box. The engines of both steamers were stopped at the time. Did not see the man Skinner fall overboard. The bell of the Cumberuna was struck as she was passing the barge of the other steamer. There was not time then to stop the engines and prevent the collision. The Cumberuna was stopped about 2 minutes before she struck the Waganya. There is sufficient room for 2 steamers to pass with barges. William Riley, seaman on board the Cumberuna. I heard only one whistle blown on board that vessel previous to the collision. It was some time before. I saw the collision take place. I did not hear any orders given to slacken speed. I did not hear Captain Mace threaten to run Page down. I could see the Waganya about half an hour before she was struck by the Cumberuna. Joseph Whitfield, seaman on board the Cumberuna. I remembered a whistle being blown and a bell struck by Mace, as witness supposed for the Waganya to stop and let them go by, about a mile above the place of the collision. I heard Mace say, "That damn fool is going on and won't let me pass." I heard Page say, "Let me get into a straight reach and I will let you go by." I did not see Page hold up his hand in warning. The 2 boats were in a reach in which they could have passed if they had wished. If the Waganya had eased her engines 5 minutes before she did, the Cumberuna could have passed without touching her. I did not see the man Skinner fall into the water. I saw him more than 10 minutes after the collision fasten a rope to a tree ashore. The Waganya was in midstream at the time and there was ample room for a steamer to pass between her and the starboard bank. The Cumberuna struck the Waganya on the quarter just abaft the paddle box. Frank Stafford, seaman on board the Cumberuna, deposed that when the first whistle was blown by the Cumberuna, the distance between the 2 steamers was less than 2 miles. The engines of the Cumberuna were eased immediately after the whistle was blown. The Cumberuna was going at full speed a short time before the collision took place. He saw Captain Page waving his hand but did not understand the signal. James Mace, master of the Cumberuna, deposed that he overtook the Waganya at the Warparina woodpile and told Page he would overhaul him about Irons Farm. On the morning of the 31st he sighted him. The witness eased his engines to let the Waganya get around the short bend at the Gulper Creek and blew his whistle to give notice. As the Cumberuna was rounding Irons Bend, the Waganya was rounding the point below, about a quarter of a mile distant. In the next small bend, the Waganya was going around while the Cumberuna was coming in front of it. There was a straight reach below and both vessels were in it together. The reach may be about 2 miles long. The witness continued to overhaul the Waganya and kept on expecting to pass her, and both vessels came to the next bend almost together. The bow of the Cumberuna kept abreast of the Waganya's paddle box. When the witness found he could not prevent a collision, he gave orders to let go the tow rope, reversed the engine, and then went to the port or the Victorian bank and told the men to go to the bank and make fast. The first, witness, knew of the man Skinner being overboard was from seeing a cork fender floating in the water. He said, "There goes a bale of wool," and called out to Skinner to get his barge ready to start. One of the men told him he was drowned. This would have been about 20 minutes after the collision. I did not call to Page to keep clear previous to the collision. On a former occasion, the same steamers were nearly coming into collision in the same part of the river. The letter produced was that sent by the witness of the board. I have been on the Murray River for 15 years, and the regulations referred to in the letter are for the first boat to port her helm and for the other boat to starboard her helm. The rule was complied with on this occasion. I noticed Page making a signal to keep off, but when he did it was too late. The witness did not then consider there was any risk of collision in the course he pursued. The Cumberuna is a faster boat than the Waganya. He was not aware of the Rule 17 of regulations for preventing collisions at sea being in force on the River Murray. He has a book of the same rules, those referred to being a copy of the Mercantile Navy List of Victoria 1868. This concluded the evidence and the board delivered the following decision. After a protracted inquiry, during which much evidence has been taken, the board has arrived at the decision that the collision between the steamers Cumberuna and Waganya was caused by the misconduct of James Mace, master of the steamer Cumberuna, by his having violated the rule which enjoins that a steamer overhauling another steamer shall keep out of the way of the last mentioned steamer. This rule was well known to the master of the Cumberuna when in his own statement he had engaged on the Murray River steamers for 15 years, and no evidence has been produced ameliorating the charge that the master of the Cumberuna did press upon a slower boat in a part of the Murray, where from his own letter to the board he states it was impossible for two steamers to pass with safety. The conduct of the master of the Cumberuna is more reprehensible, as from his own statement he had charge of the faster boat, and on a previous occasion was nearly causing a collision with the Waganya in the same narrow part of the river. The board would not be doing their duty if they did not inflict such a punishment as would have the effect of making other masters in charge of life and property on Murray River steamers more careful. The decision of the board is that the certificate of James Mace as master be suspended for 12 months. The evidence shows that the master of the Waganya did all in his power to avoid a collision. His certificate is therefore returned to him and he is exonerated from all blame. So as a result of his certificate being cancelled for 12 months, he became the proprietor of the Star Hotel in Echuca from 1870 to 1875. And in November 1870, it mentioned on Friday the application made at the Echuca bench of transferring the licence held by Mr. J. Solomon for the Star Hotel to be granted to Mr. James Mace. 5 years later, there was a mention in August 1875, publican's leave of absence. Yesterday morning at the police court, Mr. Taylor applied on behalf of James Mace of the Star Hotel for leave of absence from his licensed house for 6 weeks. Mr. Langford said that he had but a short time since granted leave of absence to the applicant. Mr. Taylor argued that he had been back at his hotel for 2 months since that leave had expired and that the business would be carried on by his wife during this absence. But Mr. Langford refused to grant the leave asked for, expressing an opinion that the applicant should look after the hotel himself, especially as he had such a short distance between being away for some weeks. Now, it seems that James deserted Sarah around 1875, so around the time that he was requesting more and more leave from the pub and having Sarah manage it, Sarah seems to have continued to maintain the pub. 2 years later, in June 1877, boxing tournament. Last night at the Temperance Hall, an exhibition of boxing and swordsmanship was given. The hall was crowded to excess by an audience exclusively of the male sex. Before the curtain rose, the crowd in the back seats, which had been unruly from the first, rushed to the front seats, and a scene of great confusion ensued for some minutes while the chairs were being scrambled for. The principal performers of the evening were Mr. James Mace, described as the retired champion of the world, Harry Sellers, the noted pugilist, and Mr. Borthwick Reed, a swordsman of repute. 2 amateur boxers came on stage and lounged at each other in an awkward fashion, making a most uncouth display. A set to with the gloves between Mace and Reed and the champion, Sellers, then took place. Reed was greatly overmatched, but Sellers was in fine form, and between him and Mace some science was shown. In the meantime, it's mentioned in South Australia in October 1878, so around a year after that boxing tournament. It says the height of James Mace, the pugilist, so in other words a boxer, who was, a few months ago in Adelaide, was 5'9" and his fighting weight 10 stone 12 pound. He was born in Norwich in 1831. In December 1878, a couple of months later, the City Licensing Bench today heard the objection raised to the application of James Mace for a licence for the VRC Hotel in Bourke Street, Melbourne. The objection was made by the police in consequence of a recent glove fight at the hotel. It was promised on behalf of the applicant that the communication between the hall and the hotel would be closed. We don't hear anything until 4 years later, and it says early on Sunday morning, a party of the detectives, headed by Duncan, made a well-organised and successful raid upon a gaming room adjoining the VRC Hotel, kept by Mr. James Mace in Bourke Street East. They arrested Mace, who was in bed at the time, and upwards of 30 others. This morning, Mace was brought up and charged with being the keeper of the house. He pleaded not guilty and was defended by Mr. Gillett. Duncan and the other detectives narrated how they surrounded the place, gained access to the gaming room owing to a door being left open, and arrested a number of men. They also found some false and other dice, a dice box, and a few heaps of money. Mace, who was in bed and complained of being ill, stated that he had sublet the room to a man named Archibald and had no control over it. For the defence, Mr. Gillett submitted that the gambling room was not part of the hotel but belonged to a different landlord and had, although originally been let to Mace, had been sublet to Archibald for £10 a week. He called Archibald to substantiate this statement, but the defendant, who was charged with being the occupier of the place, declined, under the advice of his solicitor, Mr. Reed, to make admissions which might be used against him. Other witnesses, however, gave evidence to show that Mace had let the room to Archibald and received rent from him. The bench considered the case proved and fined the defendant £25. Mr. Gillett said that his client felt aggrieved by the decision and would appeal. And a month later, Judge Noel granted an application for a rule nisi for the sequestrian of the estate of James Mace, late licensee of the VRC Hotel. So James Mace has become bankrupt. James Mace died in 1881 at the age of 50 in Bendigo Hospital. Sarah Mace died on the 24th of September 1919 in South Australia. And there was an article outlining Sarah's death in the Adelaide Advertiser. Mrs. Mace, who died recently at Port Elliot in her 82nd year, she arrived with her parents at Port Adelaide and went to live at Port Elliot in 1851. After her marriage with the late Captain James Mace, she frequently went up and down the River Murray, her husband being the master of steamboats, Lady Daly and the Cumberuna. They lived at Echuca for some years, and after her husband's death, Mrs. Mace resided with her sons in Adelaide and Melbourne. About 12 and a half years ago, she went to Port Elliot to live with her only sister, Mrs. J.G. Dodd. Mrs. Mace leaves one son, Mr. David Mace, Melbourne, and one daughter, Mrs. Arthur Prager, from Brisbane. There are 8 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. So James and Sarah Mace's children, they had 6 children. So the first child, Alice, she was born on the 26th of August 1863 at Encounter Bay, South Australia. She married Arthur William Adolph Prager in Brisbane on the 9th of August 1881 when she was 17 and Arthur 28. They had 5 children, and Alice died in Queensland in May 1950. There's an article outlining her death that says Mrs. Alice Prager, who died in Brisbane at the age of 86, had lived in Queensland for 75 years. She was the daughter of Captain James Mace and was born in Victoria. Her husband, Mr. A.W. Prager, predeceased her, and he was in the titles office. The late Mrs. Prager was one of the first members of the congregation of St Andrew's Church of England, South Brisbane, and was an active member of the Queensland Women's Electoral League in her younger days. She is survived by 2 daughters, Mrs. Bolter and Mrs. Ibbotson. The second child, John, was born in 1866 in Echuca, and he died in 1894 in Melbourne. The third child, James Cumberuna Mace, was born in 1867 in Echuca, and he died in 1897 in North Melbourne. David Waddell Mace was born in 1869 in Echuca, and he married Eliza Arnold in 1899 in Victoria. They had 3 sons, David James Mace, born at Hotham West in 1899, who died at Newcombe, Victoria in 1970. William Frederick was born on the 23rd of May 1901 in Hotham West. He married Teresa Spicer in Victoria in 1928. William enlisted in World War II on the 26th of September 1940, and he was listed as a horse driver at the time of his enlistment. He disembarked at Singapore on the 26th of January 1942 and was reported missing on the 16th of February 1942 in Malaya. He died of malnutrition at a prisoner of war camp in Java on the 22nd of July 1943. And David Waddell's third son, John Henry Mace, was born in 1904 in Hotham West. He died in North Melbourne in 1946, aged 42. He was a metal worker and living with his mother, his brother William and his wife at Moonee Ponds. And there was an article on David Waddell Mace in August 1911. It says, a man walked through the barrier gate at Flinders Street Railway platform at 8 o'clock this morning and appeared to have no idea what he was doing. One of the porters spoke to him and asked him where he was going. The man, who was dressed like a labourer on his way to work, said he did not know where he was going or whence he had come. Constable Ramsey was called in and the man was taken to the station master's office, where he was seized with a fit which lasted quarter of an hour. On recovering, he said his name was David Mace, but beyond that he could not remember anything. He was taken to Melbourne Hospital and admitted. There he said that his name was David Mace and he lived at Boundary Road, North Melbourne, but he could not give any further information concerning himself. And it further goes on to say that he left his residence to go to Port Melbourne in connection with night navvying operations at the railways there. And as he didn't return home the next day at his usual time, his wife and family were anxious and they found that he had been taken to the Melbourne Hospital. So by 1924, so 13 years later, David is listed as living alone in Boundary Road, North Melbourne. David was admitted to the Sunbury Asylum on the 5th of January 1930 due to his epilepsy dementia under the name David William Mace, and he died there on the 28th of January 1930 of acute pneumonia. So there is the interesting story of James Mace, riverboat captain, publican and boxer.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.